In the fall of 1857, Little Rock, Arkansas, hid a story so disturbing that it stayed buried for more than 100 years. On Thanksgiving night, inside what was then the grandest plantation in Pulaski County, a slave named Samson supposedly killed his master. Colonel Jeremiah Rutledge, with nothing but his bare hands, snapping the man's neck as if it were a dry twig. But this wasn't just another tale of rebellion. Witnesses whispered that Samson displayed strength beyond human limits. They claimed he crushed a man's skull with a single hand, twisted iron tools like they were soft clay, and left handprints pressed so deep into oak beams that people swore the marks could still be seen long after. The official story never made the papers. Records were sealed, witnesses silenced, and the entire event wiped from local memory. Yet 3 county officials went to their graves insisting what they saw that night couldn't be explained by natural means. So what truly happened on Rutledge Plantation that Thanksgiving? To answer that, we have to go back to the Arkansas Territory about 20 miles south of Little Rock, where the Arkansas River wound its way through some of the richest cottonland in the South. By 1857, Rutledge Plantation stretched across more than 3,000 acres, worked by nearly 200 enslaved people. At its center stood Colonel Rutledge's imposing Greek Revival mansion, a symbol of both wealth and cruelty. Unlike many plantation owners born into the system, Rutledge had chosen it. Originally from Massachusetts, he had moved south in his 20s, lured by cotton's promise of fortune. That choice came with a calculated brutality. He kept precise records of punishments, drew up breeding charts for the people he owned, and prided himself on a cold, scientific approach to managing human lives. Life on the plantation was divided between the field hands, who lived in rough cabins near the river, and the house servants, who endured slightly better conditions near the mansion. In whispered conversations, the enslaved spoke of better days under the former owner, a man far gentler than the colonel. But among them all, Samson stood apart. At 6'4", he was a giant for the time, yet his presence wasn't only about size. His past was a mystery. Rutledge had bought him 3 years earlier from a failing Louisiana plantation. The bill of sale noted unusual qualities, an extraordinary constitution, strange physical capabilities, perhaps even a medical anomaly. The seller, a Frenchman named Boudreau, had been eager to be rid of him, despite Samson's obvious value. On Rutledge's land, people soon noticed his abilities. He could labor through 16-hour days without tiring. He carried cotton bales that usually needed 2 men. His calloused hands were so hardened, they looked like horn. The blacksmith Jupiter swore Samson bent horseshoes as though they were twigs, though he never dared show it in front of the overseer. And Samson's strangeness wasn't just in his strength. His eyes held intelligence that went beyond what was allowed. Some swore he was literate. Others said they saw him at night tracing symbols into the dirt outside his cabin. Not English letters, but markings no one recognized. It was as if Samson carried with him a hidden knowledge, something powerful, something dangerous, that the Rutledge Plantation was about to learn firsthand. By the fall of 1857, something strange had begun brewing at Rutledge Plantation, just south of Little Rock, Arkansas. It all centered on one man, Samson, a slave unlike any the county had ever seen. Those who lived and worked around him noticed that his intelligence ran deeper than anyone dared say aloud, and that sometimes late at night he'd trace strange marks into the dirt shapes that looked more like formulas than letters. Colonel Jeremiah Rutledge, ever the self-styled intellectual, took a keen interest in Samson, but not out of mercy. Rutledge had heard whispers about Samson's unusual strength and saw a chance for both scientific fame and personal gain. He subscribed to phrenology journals and agricultural papers that obsessed over physical traits in human specimens. Soon enough, he started what he called strength assessments, dragging Samson into the old carriage house to lift anvils, iron machinery, even tree trunks. While Rutledge scribbled notes in leather-bound journals he kept locked away. It was all part of what he fancied a serious scientific study, timing Samson's labor, measuring his limits, and pushing him well beyond what any man should be able to endure. But by late autumn, things had taken a darker turn. Rutledge began inviting other planters to witness these so-called demonstrations. Men of means came from miles around to watch Samson lift what should be impossible, bend iron bars and snap thick wooden beams. But while the colonel entertained his guests, Samson was changing. He'd grown quiet, watchful. He moved with precision, spoke less, and began asking house servants odd questions about the layout of the mansion. Rutledge's daily routines, who had keys to what. Jupiter the blacksmith later told investigators that Samson was no longer just working, he was planning. Rutledge, meanwhile, was preparing for his most extravagant event, yet a grand Thanksgiving feast with over 40 guests from Memphis, New Orleans, and beyond, many of whom came specifically to witness Samson's strength firsthand. He even planned a special after-dinner performance that he promised would secure his place as the South's most forward-thinking plantation owner. What he didn't realize was that Samson had been listening. The house servants, silent and unnoticed as they moved through the mansion, had overheard enough to be disturbed, especially after one caught sight of Rutledge's journal left open in his study. It mentioned things like terminal experiments, ultimate strength thresholds, and acceptable losses in the name of science. Thanksgiving morning arrived clear and cold. The kitchen buzzed with activity as house slaves, led by head cook Molly Catindon, scrambled to prepare a lavish meal for 50 guests. Samson was tasked with setting up the grounds, placing chairs on the wraparound veranda, and lighting oil lamps for the evening's entertainment. But he moved differently that day, efficient, quiet, focused. Those around him noticed he was conserving his energy, choosing his moments as if pacing himself for something only he understood. Inside, Rutledge was alone in his study, reviewing his notes and fine-tuning the final demonstration. That morning's journal entry, discovered decades later in the ruins of the mansion, read, "Today, I shall push the specimen beyond all previous thresholds. Science demands nothing less than complete understanding." The carriages started arriving around noon, rolling down the oak-lined drive as the county's elite gathered for Rutledge's spectacle. Judge Cornelius Dillingham from Little Rock Planter, Samuel Vaughn from Helena, Dr. Nathaniel Peaton from Memphis. All prominent men, each curious to see if the rumors about Samson were true. But the most talked about guest was Professor Emanuel Voss, a German expert in physical anthropology, who had traveled from St. Louis just to witness the event. As the guests sipped wine on the veranda and discussed cotton prices and looming tensions between North and South, Samson continued his work with robotic precision. Around 3 p.m., Jupiter tried to speak with him, but Samson's gaze passed through him like he wasn't even there. His mind clearly focused on something far beyond the plantation grounds. Dinner itself went smoothly. The guests enjoyed roasted turkey, sugar-cured ham, cornbread stuffing, and vegetables prepared with care by hands that remained invisible to those at the table. Conversations flowed freely as the sun dipped below the tree line and the wine dulled any sense of unease. But behind the walls and under the surface, a storm was gathering. Neither Rutledge nor any of his guests knew that before the night ended, the Grand Plantation would become the scene of a mystery. Pulaski County would never forget. One man would be dead, the other would vanish, and the truth would stay buried for generations. As the evening reached its peak, Colonel Rutledge rose from his seat, face flushed with wine and pride, and called for attention. "Gentlemen," he announced, voice ringing with theatrical excitement, "tonight you will witness something that challenges everything we thought we knew about the limits of human strength." His guests, a mix of skeptical aristocrats and curious academics, followed him out to the old carriage house, their chatter lively under the torchlight. Inside, the space had been cleared for the show iron bars, heavy wooden beams, even sections of railroad iron were laid out like props on a stage. Samson stood already in position, his massive form casting a long shadow across the floor. But there was something different in the way he held himself tense, coiled, utterly still. One guest, Dr. Peaton of Memphis, would later write that looking at Samson was like staring into a storm, held in place by sheer willpower. The show began with familiar feats. Samson lifted iron weights no man should be able to move, bent thick bars with bare hands and shattered oak beams, while the crowd murmured in awe. Professor Voss from St. Louis scribbled in his notebook, muttering in German as he watched. But Rutledge wasn't satisfied. He demanded more heavier loads, thicker iron, harder challenges, and the mood began to shift. The audience, once fascinated, grew uneasy. These weren't demonstrations anymore. They were punishments disguised as science. Judge Dillingham was the first to voice concern, suggesting it might be time to end the evening. But Rutledge brushed him off, drunk on the attention. "Nonsense," he said. "We're only now approaching true discovery." He gestured toward a massive iron flywheel hauled in just that morning and ordered Samson to lift it. The room fell quiet. Samson stared at the machine, then at Rutledge, then slowly scanned the crowd. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "No, sir." The words landed like a slap. A slave refusing a direct command in front of white men of stature was beyond unthinkable. But Samson didn't flinch. Rutledge, caught between disbelief and rage, demanded he obey. Samson repeated himself, calm and deliberate. "No, sir." The crowd stiffened. Professor Voss froze mid-sentence. Judge Dillingham instinctively took a step back. Rutledge's fury turned cold and dangerous. "Do as I say," he hissed, "or what comes next will make every session before this look like kindness." For a long, charged moment, the two men stood in silence across the torchlit room. Then Samson smiled, and witnesses later said it was the most terrifying expression they had ever seen. "No, sir," he said for the last time. "I don't believe I will." What happened next took mere seconds. Samson moved faster than anyone thought possible, crossing the distance between them in 3 quick strides. Rutledge barely raised his hands before Samson's grip found its mark, and the sharp crack of the colonel's neck breaking, described by more than one guest as sounding like a thick branch snapping, echoed through the stunned silence. Rutledge, master of 3,000 acres and nearly 200 souls, was dead before his body hit the floor. But what shocked the guests most wasn't just the killing. It was the ease of it. Samson had ended his master's life with the effort of snapping a twig. For a moment, time stood still. Samson hovered over the body hand, still poised like he'd broken something fragile, then looked up at the pale, silent crowd. "Gentlemen," he said in flawless English, his voice calm and laced with an unplaceable accent, "I suggest you leave now." Panic broke like a dam. Arkansas's finest trampled each other in a desperate rush to flee, shoving, stumbling, shouting, forgetting entirely who they were in their race to escape the man who had just shattered everything they thought they understood about power. In minutes, the plantation was abandoned, except for the stunned house servants, the smoldering torches, and Samson, standing alone in the ruins of Rutledge's experiment. What happened after remains one of Pulaski County's greatest mysteries. The house slaves stayed in their quarters, terrified until sunrise. When they finally ventured out, they found the carriage house empty. The torches had burned out. The colonel's body was gone. And so was Samson, vanished without a trace. All that remained were the deep handprints in the oak beams and the quiet, paralyzing knowledge that something unimaginable had taken place. But as strange as his disappearance was, it was only the beginning of what would become an even deeper legend. One that would ripple through Arkansas folklore for generations. Within hours of the incident, messengers rode hard to Little Rock telegrams, buzzed through nearby towns, and officials descended on Rutland Plantation, expecting a clear crime scene or signs of rebellion. What they found instead launched an investigation that would consume Pulaski County for months and leave behind more questions than answers. By dawn, on November 27th, word had spread like wildfire through the web of plantation owners, overseers, and government men who formed the backbone of Arkansas society. The sheer audacity of the event, a slave not just killing his master, but vanishing without a trace, was almost secondary to the bizarre psychological fallout. Judge Cornelius Dillingham returned to Little Rock in such a state of shock, his clerk described him as barely able to dress himself. Dr. Peaton checked himself into a private sanitarium and wouldn't speak of that night for over a year. Professor Voss simply disappeared, leaving behind a hotel room, an unpaid bill, and a trunk full of notes scribbled in a mix of German and strange indecipherable symbols that some said looked like math, others like something older. Sheriff Thomas Breege arrived at the plantation at sunrise with deputies and a volunteer militia expecting signs of violence. A dead body, maybe even a slave uprising, but instead found a place frozen in eerie stillness. The house slaves, when questioned, were cooperative, but offered nothing useful. They'd heard raised voices around 10:30, seen lanterns moving after dark, but claimed they stayed put. Slaves knew better than to involve themselves in the master's affairs. When pressed about Samson, their descriptions were vague and frustrating. Yes, he was tall. Yes, he was strong. But beyond that, they couldn't or wouldn't say who he really was. Jupiter the blacksmith offered the only testimony of substance, though it bordered on the unbelievable. He admitted Samson had strength that wasn't natural. It wasn't just that he didn't tire, Jupiter said nervously, wringing his hands. It was like he ran on something else, something not like us. He spoke of seeing Samson scrawling unknown symbols in the dirt, working with strange numbers, speaking to himself in a language no one recognized. A voice not just talking, but commanding as if he was used to being obeyed. The physical evidence was no less strange. The carriage house was full of overturned weights, warped iron, and broken wood, but not a single drop of blood. No clear footprints led away from the scene, even though the damp soil should have captured them easily. And most notably, the colonel's body had disappeared without a trace. Sheriff Breege led search parties through the surrounding wilderness, dragging ponds, scouring creeks, searching barns and ravines across a 20-mile radius. Nothing. It was as though Samson had melted into the woods. As panic gripped the county governor, Elias Conway, under pressure from Arkansas's elite, offered a $500 reward, an astronomical sum bringing bounty hunters from New Orleans, Memphis, and beyond. Wanted posters soon littered the territory, bearing a description so vague it could have been anyone tall. Black male, approximately 6'4", extremely strong, dangerous. But what came next only deepened the mystery. Several bounty hunters returned with wild stories, glimpses of a towering figure moving silently through the woods at night, clearing rivers in a single bound, leaving behind enormous footprints, twisted tree trunks, or campsites where it looked like boulders had been moved by hand. Others never came back at all. Whispers began to spread. Maybe Samson wasn't just a man. Maybe he never had been. And as fears sank deeper into the Arkansas soil, even the boldest men stopped searching the forests at night. What truly unsettled officials in the weeks that followed were the strange reports filtering in from across the state. A plantation near Pine Bluff claimed its enslaved people had begun whispering constantly, glancing toward the tree line, behaving with what the owner called dangerous excitement. In Helena, an overseer abruptly quit, saying the slaves were speaking of someone called the Strong Man, a shadow figure coming to set things right. By Christmas 1857, The Samson affair had grown into a full-blown crisis for Arkansas authorities. Despite the manhunts, the generous reward, and even the involvement of federal marshals, no one was any closer to finding Samson than they had been the night he vanished. Worse, the national press had caught wind of the story. Northern newspapers, some abolitionist, others simply hungry for sensation, began printing lurid stories of the Arkansas Superman, a mysterious slave with inhuman strength who killed his master and disappeared like a ghost. That was when the first signs of a cover-up began to emerge. Governor Elias Conway, desperate to protect the state's image and calm the rising political heat between North and South, quietly ordered the investigation shut down. Records were sealed, rewards were canceled, posters were removed, editors were urged to drop the story. But just as the state tried to bury it all, a new discovery upended everything. When Colonel Rutledge's estate was finally inventoried in early 1858, his executors found something hidden deep in the false bottom of his desk. A cache of documents that hinted at a far darker truth. Among them were letters between Rutledge and several northern universities discussing advanced human experimentation enhancement protocols and the physical limits of the body. There were invoices for strange chemical compounds shipped from Boston and New York. Substances local investigators couldn't identify, but suspected had medical applications. Even more shocking was a bill of lading from New Orleans, dated just 2 weeks before Samson arrived on the plantation, listing a shipment of pharmaceutical equipment and associated materials. And then came the final document, a contract between Rutledge and a shadowy Boston firm called Meridian Research Associates, outlining terms for ongoing physiological assessment and enhancement. It was signed not only by Rutledge, but by someone labeled Subject S. In handwriting, several house servants immediately recognized as Samson's. The implications were staggering. Had Rutledge been working with northern scientists on human experimentation? Had Samson been part of it willingly? Was the strong man who snapped a colonel's neck the result of some secret project gone wrong or gone right? Arkansas officials had no appetite for answers. The documents were immediately seized, classified as sensitive estate materials, and transferred into quiet federal custody. The executors were sworn to silence. The slaves who'd identified the handwriting were sold off to distant plantations scattered far beyond Pulaski County. Every mention of Meridian Research Associates was scrubbed from public records. But secrets like that don't stay buried. Word of what had happened at Rutledge Plantation moved like wildfire through the South's underground slave networks. Stories of the strong man who broke his chains spread from quarters to camps to prayer circles. Some whispered that other plantations were conducting similar experiments, that Samson was only the first, and that others stronger, smarter, more prepared were waiting for their moment. By the time 1858 arrived, the state had officially closed the book on Samson. But the legend was just beginning. It lived on, in the uneasy glances of plantation owners, in the worried scribbles of letters never sent, and in the sealed files tucked deep inside Washington's growing vault of federal secrets. And out in the wilderness, in the dark, uncharted edges of the Arkansas frontier, there were those who claimed to have seen someone still moving through the trees. Tall, silent, waiting. The spring of 1858 brought fresh developments that only deepened the shadow surrounding Samson's disappearance and raised disturbing new questions about what had truly taken place at Rutledge Plantation. The first sign that the case was far from over came from an unexpected direction. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency quietly retained by undisclosed clients to conduct a separate investigation into the events of that fateful Thanksgiving night. Alan Pinkerton himself arrived in Little Rock in March, flanked by two of his most seasoned operatives, not to hunt Samson, but to uncover where he had really come from. While local authorities obsessed over tracking footprints and closing files, the Pinkertons focused on the time before Samson set foot in Arkansas. What they uncovered was a trail of buried secrets stretching from Louisiana bayous to northeastern laboratories. An arc of quiet research and whispered experimentation cloaked under the name human improvement. The investigation began with a bill of sale that brought Samson to Rutland Plantation. Detective James Hawthorne, undercover as a potential buyer, traveled to Louisiana to confront the original seller, a Frenchman named Boudreaux. What Hawthorne found was chilling. Boudreaux's plantation, nestled deep in the swampy lowlands south of New Orleans, had once been a testing ground for something called the Southern Health Initiative, a program allegedly intended to study common illnesses among enslaved populations. But in reality, a front for medical experimentation aimed at creating stronger, more resilient laborers. According to Boudreaux, who grew increasingly nervous at the mere mention of Samson's name, the experiments involved chemical regimens, strict physical conditioning, and so-called nutritional optimization. Most participants showed small gains. A few, however, transformed. And one Samson evolved into something entirely different. Boudreaux admitted Samson had spent over 2 years under the enhancement protocol before his sale, and while his strength was impressive, it was his mind that truly unnerved the researchers. Within months, he was reading writing-solving equations and asking questions about the treatments, about the purpose behind them, about the nature of ownership itself. When a group of enhanced subjects rebelled in 1854, killing 3 overseers and escaping into the swamps, the entire program was shut down. Most fugitives were eventually captured and quietly killed. A few, including Samson, were discreetly sold to far-flung plantations with vague warnings attached to their paperwork, phrases like unusual constitution and buyer assumes all risks. These revelations drove the Pinkertons to examine the northern ties behind the Southern Health Initiative. What they found was a tangled web of research hospitals, private labs, and universities, many in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, working on similar experiments throughout the 1840s and 1850s. Funding came from wealthy industrialists, silent government partners, and increasingly military-aligned interests who saw potential in enhancing the human body, not for cotton fields, but for battlefields. If Samson was the result of such a program, then he was never just a runaway slave. He was something much more complex, more engineered, and perhaps more dangerous. And if there had been one, there might have been others. At the center of the entire human enhancement web stood one man, Dr. Marcus Kleinman, a German émigré who had quietly built a tri-city research empire spanning Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. His work, masked by academic credentials and scientific jargon, focused on what he termed human optimization, a cocktail of chemical regimens, physical stress testing, and psychological conditioning designed to forge beings of superior capability. His subjects were not volunteers. They were taken from prisons, tenement slums, and increasingly enslaved people, bought under false pretense for experimentation. To dig deeper, Pinkerton sent one of their best detectives, Sarah Chen, disguised as a nurse, into Kleinman's Boston compound. What she found shocked even the hardened operatives of the agency. In her reports, she described meticulously kept records of more than 200 test subjects, each cataloged by physical changes, mental shifts, and what Kleinman's researchers called genetic compatibility, a chilling term that hinted at something far more eugenic than scientific. Some subjects showed modest gains. Others, exceptional ones, saw their strength triple. But it wasn't just muscle. Intelligence reflexes, even memory retention increased under the right conditions. And at the heart of it all was a steady correspondence between Kleinman and Colonel Rutland, revealing that the Thanksgiving demonstration had never been a mere curiosity, it was the final test. In one letter, Kleinman wrote that pushing Samson past his breaking point would provide crucial data for future military applications, calling Samson a prototype for the soldier of tomorrow. And yet the clean lab notes and clinical planning failed to account for one simple truth. Samson had his own plans. In late April, a breakthrough came not from Washington or Boston, but from Jupiter the blacksmith, who through a covert network of free blacks in Little Rock had remained in contact with the Pinkertons. In a hushed nighttime meeting, Jupiter revealed what few had suspected. Samson hadn't vanished into the woods by chance. He'd been preparing his escape for months. He had help. People who knew about him, people waiting for the right moment. That Thanksgiving night hadn't been an explosion of rage. It had been a planned extraction. That revelation cracked open something even bigger. Behind Samson's escape was a secret network called the Freedom Chain, an underground alliance of abolitionists, freedmen, and sympathetic insiders who had discovered the enhancement programs and saw them for what they truly were, an abomination that went beyond even the brutal mechanics of slavery. Operating since the early 1850s, the Freedom Chain specialized in extracting enhanced subjects, smuggling them to safety across borders or into deep wilderness sanctuaries. They taught control. They provided identities. They helped these broken men and women disappear into the fabric of America or beyond it. But the biggest shock came in May of 1858, when a Pinkerton raid on a safe house in Memphis uncovered coded letters and foreign seals. British and French intelligence, it seemed, had infiltrated the Freedom Chain, not to liberate but to observe, perhaps even to capture. The letters revealed a geopolitical nightmare, foreign powers quietly studying America's forbidden science, hoping to harness these enhanced individuals for their own ends. If Samson or others like him have crossed into foreign hands, Pinkerton warned in his final classified report that we are no longer in control of what we have created. The agency was ordered to shut down the investigation. Files were locked, agents reassigned. But the unease never left. In certain corners of Washington, military officers and shadowy government officials whispered of a future war, not just of men and muskets, but of men like Samson. Meanwhile, out in the wild places of Arkansas, the stories refused to die. Tales drifted in from logging camps and river towns of a tall, silent figure who could twist iron and vanish like smoke. In black communities, he was remembered as a liberator. Among native tribes, he was honored as a wandering spirit of justice. And in the minds of the men who once tried to control him, Samson remained something worse than a fugitive. He was a reminder, a ghost of their sins, and perhaps a harbinger of what was still to come. In the ruins of what had once been Rutland Plantation, now crumbling beneath moss and vines as the Arkansas wilderness reclaimed its bones, strange things continued to stir. Visitors who dared to approach the site spoke of deep handprints in ancient oak beams that somehow grew more defined with time, not less. Some claimed the very soil near the old carriage house felt unnaturally dense, as though pressed down by an immense force. And on still nights when the wind held its breath, there were whispers of heavy footsteps echoing through the darkened ruins, as if something or someone was silently testing its strength against the invisible ghosts of the past. As the summer of 1858 gave way to autumn 1 year after the Thanksgiving night that shattered the illusion of control, the mystery of Samson evolved beyond a local legend into something darker, more organized, and infinitely more threatening. The questions no longer revolved around where Samson had gone, but what he had become and what his escape might mean for a nation already teetering on the edge of civil war, torn between freedom and oppression, and facing the terrifying question of what it truly meant to be human. Just as authorities thought the nightmare might fade, Arkansas descended deeper into horror. In October near Camden, the Henley plantation, owned by one of the state's most powerful cotton magnates, was the site of an event that shook the region. 3 newly acquired slaves, each purchased from a Louisiana dealer, with the same cryptic wording once used to describe Samson, unusual physical capabilities, and possible medical anomaly, escaped. But this wasn't any ordinary escape. According to Overseer James Huckabee, the 3 men known only by the names Caesar Goliath and Titan didn't break locks. They broke the iron shackles themselves with their bare hands. "I've managed slaves for 20 years," Huckabee told investigators, pale and shaking. "And I've never seen anything like that night." He described how the men moved in total silence, navigating the dark, like they could see through it, acting with coordinated precision, as if following a rehearsed plan. Every chain, every restraint, every shackle on the plantation was destroyed. Not just theirs, but all of them, as if they intended to eliminate the very tools of captivity. They left behind no noise, no blood, and no trace beyond the scattered remnants of a slave system torn apart by bare hands. When they vanished, they took with them maps of the surrounding region and supplies clearly gathered over time, evidence of a calculated operation, not desperation. Within weeks, more reports began surfacing. In Mississippi, 2 enhanced individuals broke free from a covert research station near Natchez. Leaving the facility, gutted its walls, adorned with twisted metal and broken machinery contorted into grotesque abstract shapes. In Louisiana, 4 subjects escaped what had been called an escape-proof holding facility, but not before incinerating every document connected to the enhancement program. It became impossible to dismiss the pattern. These weren't isolated breakouts, they were coordinated strikes. These enhanced individuals knew where they were, what had been done to them, and how to erase the evidence before vanishing. It soon became clear they were being guided perhaps by a central intelligence that understood the full scope of the enhancement experiments. Worse still, the escapees weren't just surviving, they were winning. Marcus Kleinman, the architect of the original enhancement protocol, arrived in Little Rock in November, under federal orders to assess the growing emergency. What he presented behind closed doors terrified even hardened military minds. These subjects, he said, had been fundamentally altered, not just in strength, but in cognition. Kleinman revealed that enhanced individuals were showing signs of not only increased intelligence, but something far stranger, a breakdown of internal mental limitations. Their memories were sharper. They learned faster. They adapted instantly. And most disturbing of all, they appeared to be operating as a collective, not a simple network, but something closer to a shared consciousness. In his final briefing, Kleinman issued the warning no one wanted to hear. "We may have created a new form of human being, one that no longer sees us as equals, one that may not even see us as necessary." By the close of 1858, the implications of the Samson phenomenon had reached a breaking point. What had once seemed like the disappearance of a single enhanced fugitive had transformed into a threat so profound it shook the foundations of the nation's power structure. Federal authorities no longer saw Samson as just another escapee. Increasingly, they feared he was something far more dangerous, a coordinating intelligence behind a rapidly growing network of enhanced individuals, a strategist with vision, purpose, and the power to execute both. Reports from across the Arkansas Territory spoke of an impossibly tall figure appearing near plantations and experimental facilities shortly before mass breakouts, suggesting someone was conducting advanced reconnaissance planning operations with military precision. The most detailed account came from bounty hunter Thomas Bogard, who had tracked enhanced subjects since the Camden incident. In late November, near the Buffalo River in northern Arkansas, Bogard claimed he encountered Samson standing silently on a canyon ledge 30 feet above. "The moment I saw him," Bogard told federal marshals, "I knew I wasn't taking him in alive." Samson stood nearly 7 feet tall, broad as a barn door, But it wasn't his size that frightened the hardened hunter. It was his eyes. Cold, intelligent measuring. He looked at me like he was calculating how long it would take to kill me and deciding if I was worth the trouble. But Samson hadn't attacked. Instead, he spoke calmly, fluently, in perfect English, with the cadence of someone long educated. "You're hunting the wrong prey," he said. "Men like me aren't the problem. You are. You created this. You treat people like animals, like raw material to be broken, tested, discarded. That's going to end whether you want it to or not." And then, without another word, Samson stepped backward off the ledge and vanished. Bogard scrambled up, but found only the deep prints of massive hands in the stone. No footprints, no blood, no sign he'd ever been there. Just silence. By December, the situation had escalated so drastically that President James Buchanan began receiving confidential daily briefings. Advisors and military leaders had begun calling it the Samson crisis, a term that would echo for generations in secret federal files. The ramifications extended far beyond law enforcement. This wasn't just about escaped property. It struck at the very heart of slavery, state sovereignty, scientific ethics, and what it meant to be human in a country on the edge of war. Generals began drawing up contingency plans for what they called enhanced subject containment operations. But the problem was, no one even knew how many enhanced subjects existed. There were no central records. The research had been decentralized, hidden under layers of secrecy scattered across plantations, universities, and private facilities, with little oversight. In a confidential memo, General Winfield Scott warned the War Department, "We may be facing an insurgency led by individuals whose physical and cognitive abilities surpass our understanding. They are coordinated, they are strategic, and they may be beyond our ability to contain." The final blow of the year came on New Year's Eve at a clandestine facility in the Cumberland Mountains of eastern Tennessee, a military installation so secret even the president hadn't been briefed on its existence. The site had been experimenting on volunteer soldiers. Men promised power, strength, glory in exchange for submission to the enhancement process. That night, a force of enhanced individuals attacked the facility. Survivors described not a riot or rampage, but a meticulously executed assault. They struck the communications relay first. Then they moved floor by floor, destroying records, disabling equipment, and freeing subjects. They knew the layout better than we did, admitted Major William Kittenden, the officer in charge. They didn't kill anyone, but they made sure we knew they could have. The entire operation took less than 2 hours. And when the military finally regained control, they found the lab stripped bare and a single message carved into the wall of the main research chamber. The letters 2 inches deep in solid stone. "The chains are broken. The strong shall no longer serve the weak. A new age begins." It was signed not with a name, but with a symbol, broken shackles. That same mark would later be identified at every known site of coordinated escape or sabotage. What had started as a scientific aberration and evolved into a series of eerie events had now become something else entirely, a movement. A rebellion led by men and women reshaped by science, hardened by suffering, and guided by something more dangerous than strength purpose. The Samson crisis was no longer a secret. It was a reckoning. And somewhere in the wilderness, the first of their kind, patient, watchful, and impossibly strong, was already planning what came next. As 1859 broke over a fractured nation already groaning under the weight of its moral contradictions and the gathering storm of civil war, the Samson crisis emerged not just as a security threat, but as an existential one. The enhanced individuals who had once been dismissed as aberrations or scientific curiosities were now something else entirely an organized force with a mission. They weren't just seeking freedom for themselves. They were systematically dismantling the very infrastructure that had created them. The plantations, the laboratories, the holding centers, the research files, the ideology of ownership itself, and at the center of it all, somewhere deep in the wilderness where law and power could not reach, Samson was no longer hiding. He was leading. What had started as a trail of broken shackles now looked more like the opening movements of a calculated war, one not just of muscle and might, but of ideas, justice, and reckoning. No one expected the next flashpoint to erupt, not in the woods of Arkansas or the swamps of Louisiana, but in the very heart of the Union, Washington, D.C. It began with what should have been a routine probe into government contracting fraud. But when Congressman Joshua Giddings of Ohio, a fierce abolitionist, received an unmarked package, the crisis detonated at the highest levels of power. Inside were hundreds of pages, correspondence, medical diagrams, budget allocations, field notes. Together, they formed an unbroken chain of evidence, linking government agencies, private investors, elite universities, and military factions to a nationwide human experimentation program stretching back nearly a decade. But buried among the clinical detail was the most damning revelation: a master roster listing over 300 enhanced individuals by name, location, experimental category, and status: captured, escaped, terminated. At the top of the list, flagged as both the most advanced subject and the current leader of active resistance, was one name written in larger, darker script than the rest: Samson. Giddings, horrified, immediately called for congressional hearings describing the program as a national crime, a system of federally funded human trafficking, torture, and biological experimentation hiding behind a veil of agricultural research. Southern representatives erupted in fury, accusing him of violating states' rights and fabricating slander to stir abolitionist sentiment. But momentum was shifting. Northern politicians, bolstered by abolitionist press and a shocked public, forced the creation of a select committee on human experimentation. When the hearings opened on April 21st in the Capitol building, crowds gathered like it was a spectacle, but few were prepared for what they would hear. The first witness was Dr. Marcus Kleinman himself, dragged from the shadows and placed under oath. What he revealed stunned even the most hardened skeptics. The enhancement protocol, he began, voice trembling through a thick German accent, was born from good intentions. We believed stronger bodies would mean fewer deaths in the fields, less suffering, but as the questioning intensified, Kleinman could no longer hide behind euphemisms. He admitted that what began as physiological study had transformed into full-scale human augmentation, conducted without consent, oversight, or ethical restraint. Subjects had been dosed with untested compounds pushed to their physical and mental breaking points, and in the case of Samson, evolved into something beyond human understanding. He was our most successful creation, Kleinman said quietly, and our greatest failure. We enhanced his body. We sharpened his mind. But we failed to anticipate his spirit. Samson saw what we were, and he refused to be ours. At that moment, it became clear that what America faced was not a simple rebellion, but a reckoning born in its deepest sins, scientific, economic, and moral. A reckoning that bore a name, and that name was Samson. By the final days of April 1859, the Samson crisis had grown from a whispered legend into a constitutional reckoning, one that revealed not only the brutal extent of human experimentation in America, but the terrifying consequences of tampering with the very nature of humanity. In sworn testimony before Congress, Marcus Kleinman made the admission that would burn through the newspapers and drawing rooms of the nation like wildfire. Samson's physical capabilities exceeded normal human baselines by over 400%. His intellect had surpassed their most ambitious forecasts, and his psychological profile revealed a level of independence and strategic foresight that made him fundamentally unsuitable for continued bondage. But it was what came next that truly stunned the country. Kleinman admitted the program had metastasized beyond enslaved people, expanding to include prisoners, immigrants, and eventually volunteer soldiers who had never been fully informed about the risks they were assuming. What had begun as a secret project, justified by the brutal logic of slavery, had become something far worse. A nationwide machine of human engineering, funded by shadowy federal contracts and driven by the ambition to shape a new kind of person. A weaponized citizen, built for endurance, obedience, and war. On the second day of hearings, the closed-door testimony of General Winfield Scott revealed that the War Department had quietly backed enhancement research since 1852. The goal: soldiers who could survive battlefield extremes, execute impossible missions, and gain a permanent edge over foreign adversaries. But the results, Scott confessed, had been catastrophic. Enhanced soldiers proved too independent, too defiant. Many had deserted with classified knowledge. Several were court-martialed. 2 were executed. And the program was shut down in 1857, too late to contain the dozens of enhanced operatives who had vanished into the world, their bodies altered, their allegiances unknown. But none of this compared to what happened on April 25th. That morning, the committee confirmed it had received a formal written communication from Samson himself, delivered through unnamed intermediaries and entered into the congressional record. The statement began with chilling clarity: to the representatives of the American people, I write to you not as a former slave, not as a fugitive, but as a free man who has broken the chains that bound not just my body, but my mind and spirit as well. What followed was a searing indictment of the country's moral contradictions, a first-hand account of his capture, experimentation, and awakening, not just to his physical potential, but to the larger lie of American liberty. Through the enhancement process, he wrote, we have gained not just strength, but clarity about the institutions of this nation and the truth behind its promises. Samson accused the government, the scientific community, and the economic elite of reducing human beings to assets, labor units, test subjects, disposable tools. You speak of freedom and equality, he wrote, but those words are calculated. They are doled out when convenient and revoked when profit demands it. And then came the final paragraph. A thunderclap in ink: we, the enhanced subjects who have broken free from bondage, do not seek revenge. We seek justice. We demand the immediate end of all enhancement programs. We demand the release of all captive subjects. And we demand recognition as free human beings with rights equal to any other American. If these demands are not met, we will take whatever actions are necessary to secure our freedom, and the freedom of those still in chains. The statement was signed not just by Samson, but by 51 other enhanced individuals, transforming what had been assumed to be a scattered insurgency into a formal political entity, a declaration of sovereignty from beings whose power made them terrifying, but whose demands echoed the founding ideals the nation had long betrayed. The Southern reaction was instant and furious, with plantation states calling for immediate military action, no matter the cost. But in the North, the tide was shifting. For many abolitionists and even moderates, shaken by what they'd heard, the enhanced subjects weren't monsters. They were victims who had become revolutionaries, and their demands, though delivered by superhuman hands, were unmistakably human at heart. By the spring of 1859, the Samson crisis had become more than a threat, it had become a national reckoning. As the country continued to fracture along the lines of slavery, freedom, and state sovereignty, This new and uncontrollable force, born of science, oppression, and rebellion, pushed it closer to collapse. President Buchanan, caught between fear and political pressure, authorized the most extensive manhunt in American history. Troops were dispatched across the frontier. Federal bounties soared to unprecedented levels. A special task force was assembled to find, capture, or eliminate what officials now called enhanced insurgents. But even as soldiers fanned out across the countryside, a disturbing shift took place. Reports filtered in from urban centers: Washington, Philadelphia, New York, Charleston. Enhanced individuals were no longer hiding. They were moving among the public, quietly gathering intelligence on military outposts, government buildings, and research facilities. And then on May 15th, Samson himself emerged, not in the wilderness, but in the heart of the nation's capital. Witnesses described a giant moving through Washington's streets with calm authority, as if no law could touch him. He made no effort to hide. He simply walked to the Capitol and requested a meeting with the Congressional Committee investigating the program that had created him. The request was denied. He was a fugitive, not a diplomat. But that denial did nothing to diminish the impact of his presence. His very appearance in Washington sent a message clearer than any testimony: the age of hiding was over. Samson left the city without violence, but not without leaving his mark. Carved into the marble steps of the Capitol in deep, jagged letters were 6 chilling words: "The experiment is over. The specimens have become the scientists." By nightfall, he had vanished, leaving only gouged stone and a shaken nation behind. With that single act, the crisis reached its apex. No longer could the government deny that it had created something it could not control, and yet it was not war that resolved the Samson crisis. It was diplomacy. In the weeks that followed, as the public fumed and politicians blustered, quiet negotiations began through abolitionist intermediaries and sympathetic federal officials who recognized that brute force would only spark bloodshed and revolution. President Buchanan, facing the limits of military action, secretly authorized Secretary of War John Floyd to make contact. What followed was a summer of clandestine negotiation, veiled meetings, encrypted correspondence, and shifting alliances that culminated in an unprecedented, unacknowledged settlement, the Washington Compact. Though never formally recognized in any public document, its core provisions were monumental. All human enhancement research under federal authority would cease immediately. Every known document, subject file, and medical record would be destroyed. Enhanced individuals would be offered new identities, financial support, and in cases where desired medical intervention to suppress their abilities and allow peaceful reintegration into society. Most remarkably, the compact included a geopolitical arrangement, a deal with Russian officials allowing enhanced communities to establish settlements in the remote, then Russian-held Alaskan wilderness, far from prying eyes. The gesture not only served American interests ahead of the future Alaska Purchase, but provided a self-governed sanctuary for those enhanced individuals who wished to live freely but apart. Dr. Marcus Kleinman, whose explosive congressional testimony had exposed the program, was instrumental in the compact's implementation. In exchange for full immunity, he surrendered all remaining medical data, assisted in formulating treatment protocols, and helped broker the deal with foreign partners. Not all enhanced individuals chose integration. Some preferred isolation. Others vanished into myth. But many accepted the offer and slipped quietly into new lives under new names. Their abilities dulled, their pasts erased. The implementation of the compact required surgical secrecy, and for the most part, it worked. No press conferences, no records. Just a quiet dismantling of a nightmare the government could no longer contain. By the time the first shots of the Civil War were fired in 1861, the Samson crisis had become something else. a closed chapter buried beneath layers of classified agreements, redacted files, and historical amnesia. But in whispered stories passed through generations, in remote villages, near icy rivers, or in unusual family histories that never quite added up, the legacy of the enhanced lived on. And buried deep beneath the foundation of the modern nation, there still pulsed a question that no government dared answer aloud. What happens when the created decide to create themselves? In the final months of 1859, the aftermath of the Samson crisis unfolded. Not with gunfire or spectacle, but with a careful, deliberate effort to offer a path forward, one rooted in choice. Through the same underground network that had once hidden them from bounty hunters and federal agents, enhanced subjects across the country were contacted and given the option that had never been offered before: control over their own futures. Those who chose integration were provided with new identities, modest financial support, and access to experimental medical treatments designed to reduce their enhanced abilities to manageable levels. These individuals quietly vanished into the fabric of Northern society, becoming farmers, craftsmen, business owners, always careful to hide their advantages, always mindful of what had been taken from them. Some used their gifts to aid the Underground Railroad, moving through shadows not as fugitives, but as liberators. Others, like Samson, chose a different path. In the summer of 1859, he oversaw the safe relocation of dozens of enhanced individuals to the Alaskan frontier, where hidden communities were founded in cold, wild places beyond the reach of government or vengeance. His final message, sent to federal negotiators in August, reflected the same moral clarity and leadership that had defined his rise. "I have no desire to live among people who view men like me as property or weapons. But I seek no unnecessary suffering. This compact offers peace, not surrender, not silence. I only hope future generations learn from the mistakes that made us necessary." Samson disappeared after that into Alaska, into legend. But his influence remained. The congressional investigation into the enhancement program was quietly wrapped up that autumn, its conclusions sanitized to avoid public panic or political fallout. Dr. Kleinman and other key researchers were reassigned to remote government facilities, restricted from any further human experimentation. The enhanced communities in Alaska remained a secret spoken of only in whispered reports from traders and native guides who told of villages where the people were impossibly strong, impossibly wise, and fiercely committed to justice. These settlements stayed in quiet contact with federal intermediaries, serving as a living reminder of the costs of unchecked ambition. Most importantly, the Washington Compact, though never publicly acknowledged, marked the beginning of what would later become the foundation of ethical standards in government-sponsored human research. Its secret provisions introduced concepts like informed consent, risk disclosure, and voluntary participation principles that wouldn't enter public policy for another 100 years, but which first took root in the ashes of the Samson crisis. And then came the Civil War. The fires of that brutal, all-consuming conflict soon eclipsed the events of the previous decade, and the story of the enhanced was quietly lost, buried beneath battlefield reports, emancipation proclamations, and the reconstruction of a nation. The records were sealed, the names forgotten. But in archives untouched for generations in the distant mountains of Alaska, and perhaps in the DNA of a few families scattered across the country, the legacy of Samson endured not as a monster or a myth, but as a man who dared to confront the machinery that built him, and who walked away stronger than anyone expected, including those who made him. But the legacy of Samson and the enhanced subjects who followed him stretched far beyond the quiet resolution of their crisis. In the remote wilderness of Alaska, the communities they founded became unlikely centers of knowledge and innovation, developing techniques in agriculture, medicine, and engineering that would eventually shape the territory's future. Those who chose integration left their mark in more subtle ways. Several became influential voices in the abolitionist movement, using their enhanced insight and lived experience to help dismantle the very institution that once justified their exploitation. Yet the true impact of the Samson crisis wasn't technological or even political. It was moral. These individuals hadn't merely escaped their captors. They had exposed the lie at the heart of a society that claimed to value liberty while systematically denying it. They didn't just resist bondage, they shattered the logic that made such bondage seem acceptable. As decades passed and official records were buried or erased, Samson's story drifted from history into legend. But in certain circles among scholars of medical ethics, civil rights advocates, and Alaskan elders who still remembered the strange, strong, and just people who once settled among them, the tale endured. A cautionary reminder of how far cruelty can reach when cloaked in science, and how far dignity can rise when someone finally says no. At the ruins of Rutland Plantation, the oak beams of the carriage house still bore the marks of that refusal. Deep handprints pressed into the wood not by violence, but by conviction. Visitors described not fear, but reverence. Because those prints weren't just signs of physical strength. They were the evidence of something even more powerful, a human spirit that refused to be engineered, owned, or broken. And that's what makes this story so haunting. The greatest horrors in our history weren't born from monsters or myths, but from the cold decisions of people who chose to treat others as less than human. But this story also reminds us that freedom once kindled is a force no system can contain. So what do you think really happened to Samson and the others? Were all the secrets truly revealed? Or are there still files locked away in archives the public may never see? Leave a comment and share your theories. We'd love to hear what you think. If this story of hidden history, human resilience, and ethical reckoning moved you, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the notification bell so you never miss another mystery the powerful would rather keep buried. And join us next time as we uncover another forgotten chapter 1. That still echoes through the present, whether we choose to see it or not.
Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.